You are listening to The Opium Wars, Part 2, Harrying the Coast, written and narrated by Mark Felton. This is an audio-only episode. The opening engagements in the First Opium War had proved to be unmitigated military and naval disasters for the Chinese Empire. The question is, why did the Chinese armed forces perform so poorly against the British? The answer may lie in the Chinese administrative system, which was riddled with corruption and self-interest that led to military paralysis when decisive action was called for. Officials have always been masters of self-protection, and in the case of a well-armed and aggressive adversary like the British hammering on the national door, Chinese officials fretted about the correct response, hence the token resistance put up by various Chinese admirals and generals during the First Opium War. Chinese officials would order a half-baked defense, largely so that when they lost the battle, they could claim that it was not their fault due to outside factors, notably their opponents' technological advantages. In this way, the officials generally kept their positions and sinecures, and most vitally, their heads. Officials always looked to their superiors for orders that were often not forthcoming or vague when given. The result was passivity when firm action was required. Chinese mandarins, military officers, and officials simply hunkered down and waited for the British storm to pass, made the correct noises, and generally survived the typhoon to continue their corrupt and self-serving governance. The Chinese were prepared to negotiate and horse trade with the British in the hope that a few territorial concessions would satisfy the land-hungry barbarians, and these diplomatic moves were as opaque as everything else in China. The British were exasperated by the long-winded Chinese way of negotiating, and this led to more frustration and fighting. Following the British victory at the Boca Tigris forts, Admiral Elliot met with Commissioner Qi on the 20th of January 1841 to sign a convention with regard to Canton. The port city, it was agreed, would be open for trade by the 2nd of February. This date came and went, and still the Chinese did not open the city. On the 11th to 12th of February, a further meeting was held at the Boca Tigris. Elliot gave the Chinese another 10 days to open Canton. Commodore Bremer was less than impressed with the Chinese attitude. Quote, "I must confess that from this moment my faith in the Chinese commissioner was completely destroyed." Unquote. Officers witnessed a build-up of Chinese strength on North Wantong Island, and on the 13th of February, Bremer dispatched Nemesis to Canton, where she was ordered to remain until the 18th of February, awaiting Commissioner Qi's reply to the British terms. On the morning of the 19th, the Nemesis returned without any reply from the Chinese having materialized. As the vessel passed North Wantong Island, she was fired on. The Lieutenant Governor of Canton offered 30,000 Chinese dollars for the heads of Elliot and Bremer, or $50,000 if they were taken alive. In the meantime, the Chinese had received some reinforcements. On the 21st of February, General Xiang and 1,000 regular soldiers from Hunan arrived in Canton, followed by General Yang and 1,000 Yunnan troops. Commissioner Qi inspected these new arrivals and their defensive positions on the 24th to 26th of February, just as the British were further reducing his defences downriver. Captain Thomas Herbert aboard the devil ship Nemesis, accompanied by Rear Admiral Elliot, sailed the back passage past Anonghoi Island in the Pearl River on the 23rd of February 1841. Herbert, a member of the Irish landed gentry who had joined the Navy in 1803 and had served worldwide, including fighting pirates off Cuba and Mexico, had sailed to China via the perilous Cape Horn route in 1840 aboard HMS Calliope. The Nemesis led an assault force that consisted of Calliope, Samarang, Herald, and Alligator. Without warning, the vessels ran into a masked Chinese battery. The offending battery was quickly captured after light Chinese resistance. 20 to 30 Chinese were killed for no British casualties and 80 cannon captured. 3 days later, the British fleet attacked the forts on Anonghoi and North Wantong Islands. Captain Sir Humphrey Senhouse aboard HMS Blenheim commanded the assault on Anonghoi, assisted by the Melville, Queen and 4 rocket boats. 59-year-old Senhouse, a Trafalgar veteran who had already been in the Navy for 43 years, had been mentioned in dispatches for his gallantry during the fighting in America in 1813, and had been knighted first by Hanover in 1832 and then by Britain 2 years later. In 1839 he had been appointed second in command of naval forces in China. The South Anonghoi fort was reduced first, the Blenheim dropping anchor 600 yards distant and firing concentrated broadsides. 5 minutes later the Melville anchored just 400 yards from the fort and opened fire. The Chinese made a desultory reply and then their gun crews fled. Senhouse immediately landed 300 Royal Marines, who quickly overwhelmed the few remaining defenders and captured the fort. Within 2 hours of the operation starting, all of Anonghoi's forts were in British hands. Admiral Guen Tianpei had been killed in one of the forts, along with over 200 of his men. Family members identified his body on the 27th of February, and HMS Blenheim fired a gun salute in Gwen's honour as his body was being repatriated. It was an interesting gesture in the midst of a bloody campaign and was indicative of the British attitude towards their adversaries. A British officer wrote of Gwen, "His death excited much sympathy throughout the force. He fell by bayonet wound in his breast as he was meeting the enemy at the gate of Anonghoi, yielding up his brave spirit willingly to do a soldier's death, when his life could only be preserved through the entertaining of degradation." Now it was the turn of the North Fort. The warships Wellesley, Samarang, Druid, Herald, Alligator and Modeste bombarded North Wantong Island into bloody submission. The batteries, manned by over 2,000 Chinese soldiers, were silenced in less than an hour. Major Thomas Pratt led the landing party ashore that consisted of 1,037 troops from the 26th and 49th Foot, 37th Madras Native Infantry, Bengal Volunteers and Royal Marines. During the short fighting that followed, the British lost 5 men wounded, while the Chinese suffered 250 killed or wounded and 1,300 taken prisoner. The disparity in casualties was glaring. Pratt's troops captured a staggering 339 Chinese cannon. Another series of Chinese river defences had been dealt with, taking the British a step closer to Canton. On the 27th of February, Calliope, Herald, Alligator, Sulphur, Modeste, Madagascar and Nemesis resumed their advance up the Canton River from the Boca Tigris. The ships passed Tiger Island and Second Bar before they reached First Bar Island at noon. Here the British spotted the 34-gun former East Indiaman Cambridge flying the red flag of a Chinese admiral. Field fortifications mounted 47 cannon, and row upon row of white tents in the paddy fields beyond marked the camp of the regular Imperial Chinese reinforcements from Hunan and Yunnan. Upriver loitered over 40 war junks. It seemed clear to British officers surveying this array of defences with telescopes that the Chinese still had plenty of fight left in them. The Chinese gun positions opened fire, and Modeste quickly closed to within 300 yards of the shore and returned fire with interest. Rockets from the Madagascar and Nemesis screamed off in the direction of the Chinese camp, setting much of it on fire. The Cambridge, the only modern ship that the Chinese possessed, opened fire, but British warships battered her mercilessly, with most of her crew jumping overboard and swimming for the shore. The war junks wisely stayed well out of range of the British broadsides, their crews watching the seeming inexorable progress of the barbarians up the river with awe, anger and fear. After an hour of trading fire with the Chinese, Captain Herbert ordered the landings to commence. "I landed with the seamen and marines," he wrote, "and stormed the works, driving before us upwards of 2,000 of their best troops and killing nearly 300. Every Chinese fort was in British hands within 30 minutes of the first landing, an incredible testament to the fighting qualities of the troops involved, and once again a damning indictment of poor Chinese leadership and tactical acumen. Lieutenant Watson and a party of seamen boarded the battered Cambridge and captured the vessel after a short but sharp hand-to-hand fight with the remaining Chinese crew. The ship's magazine was deliberately exploded just after dark. In total, the British lost 1 man killed and 8 wounded during the entire operation. Chinese losses were again astoundingly heavy. General Xiang and about 300 of his men fell, while another 300 were wounded. Another 98 cannon were captured and disposed of by the British. It was fast shaping up into one of the most one-sided wars in history. On the 2nd of March, Bremer dispatched Captain Belcher and HMS Sulphur to reconnoitre the Junk River, one of many waterways that led into Canton. Lacking an engine, the Sulphur was being towed down the river by 3 ship's boats, under the command of Lieutenant Richard Simmons, when 25 dug-in guns on Whampoa Island, now the Wangpu district of Guangzhou, opened fire. Simmons immediately ordered the tow lines cut, and then the 3 cutters pulled hard for the island and landed. The sailors, who were not trained infantrymen, stormed the forts that were defended by 250 Chinese troops and put them to flight into the nearby jungle, where they were harried by cannon fire from the Sulphur. The British captured the forts for the loss of only 1 man, destroyed all the guns and blew up the magazines. Between 15 and 20 Chinese were killed. Major General Hugh Gough arrived at the British fleet aboard HMS Cruiser to take over command of all future land operations from Commodore Bremer. Gough was one of the 19th century's most celebrated soldiers, who by the end of his career had commanded more general actions than any other army officer except the Duke of Wellington. Born into an Anglo-Irish family in 1779, Gough was commissioned in 1794 into the 78th Highlanders, with whom he had served in southern Africa and the West Indies. With the 87th Royal Irish Fusiliers, he had taken part in the attack on Puerto Rico and later captured Suriname. During the Peninsular War, Gough had served under Wellington and was wounded several times, including at the crucial Battle of Talavera. For his services on the Iberian Peninsula, Gough was knighted by King Charles III of Spain and promoted to Major General in 1830. He was to prove indispensable during the First Opium War, when energetic generalship was required, and was appointed Commander-in-Chief of British Land Forces. The Chinese never managed to find their own Gough to rally and lead their own forces with determination and energy. Their system of military patronage simply did not produce such officers at the time. Nemesis and 3 other vessels under Captain James Scott were sent on a reconnaissance of the Broadway River, another of the Pearl's tributaries, as the British probed for a way into Canton. On the 13th of March, the British vessels came under fire from Hu Ching Fort and from a collection of war junks. In a short, sharp little fight, the fort was first silenced and then stormed, and the junks blasted out of the water. 115 Chinese guns were captured and 9 junks sunk. British casualties were again ludicrously small, just 3 men wounded. British forces now approached their prize, Canton. The Chinese defences looked formidable, but judging by their previous desultory performances in the battles to defend the Pearl River, the British were not overly worried. Nevertheless, what was to happen at Canton was surprising and historical. The British assault on Canton began on the 18th of March 1841, when 4 divisions of ships approached from the western and southern branches of the river. The British would quickly take the wharf and docks, but the rest of Canton was well defended. As usual, the Chinese relied on static forts armed with cannon. The foreigners' trading area, or Canton factories, was defended by the Red Fort, mustering 20 cannon. Another fort named Dutch Folly was mounted with 25 guns, while the Chinese arsenal was covered by another sandbag position with 13 cannon. Finally, the Chinese had moored 2 junks opposite the Admiral's house on the waterfront, armed with 15 guns. The British determined to capture the wharf area and the foreign trading buildings, the main target being the 2-story Old British factory. Leading the assault was Captain Bourchier. By noon on the 18th of March, the British had silenced and then stormed the batteries defending the Macau Channel. HMS Modeste was placed 300 yards in front of the principal Chinese battery, while the Madagascar quickly joined in the bombardment. HMS Algerine and Starling passed on ahead, cutting through the other British ships. They engaged the Chinese war junks and destroyed them all. The tenders Hebe and Louisa, under the cover of the warship's guns, landed Royal Marines, who swiftly completed the capture of the Canton wharf area and the foreign factories, despite quite determined Chinese resistance. A general advance soon carried the landing parties to the British factory, from which the Union Jack was triumphantly hoisted to cheers and much waving of shakos and muskets. Captain Bourchier was the hero of the hour. His quick actions at the conclusion of the fighting undoubtedly saved Canton's suburbs and the hundreds of thousands of Chinese living there from a major disaster. I cannot refrain mentioning Bourchier's conspicuous and energetic exertions in towing off the burning junks, wrote Captain Herbert to Commodore Bremer, which were drifting upon the suburbs of Canton, and soon would have evidently set fire to that part of the city and involved the destruction of the whole. The port of Canton, excluding the walled city, was now under British occupation for the cost of only 7 wounded. The Chinese had suffered over 400 casualties. The Chinese were not content to let the British control the port, and less than 3 months later they made a determined effort to drive the invaders back into the river. The British had set up defensive positions, and these were unsuccessfully assaulted by thousands of Chinese on the 21st of May 1841. The British decided that the only way to prevent further attacks was to capture the entire of Canton, meaning the great walled city, an extremely hazardous undertaking. Canton, a city then of 1.5 million, was defended by a massive wall 30 feet high. 30 to 40,000 men garrisoned the wall and several forts that were located outside the city gates. The city was surrounded by flooded paddy fields, forcing an approaching army onto 2-foot-wide bunds, or mud banks, that meant that only the smallest artillery guns could be dragged forward. The British decided to try and capture the high ground north of the city wall and the banks of the river running along the west side of the city. 2 forces were available to the British. The Royal Navy would land around 1,000 Royal Marines and sailors, while General Gough commanded 2,223 British and Indian soldiers. The 23rd of May was spent reconnoitring the Chinese positions by land and water, and gathering up local sampans and junks that could be used to land the assault forces. The main landing was scheduled for the morning of the 24th. 2 columns would be used, with Gough commanding the right column that included Captain Bourchier and his naval brigade. As the 24th was also Queen Victoria's birthday, a general gun salute was fired, undoubtedly a mystifying event to the local defenders. The right column landed safely at noon, piloted through the river by Captain Belcher. A unit of the 49th Foot quickly threw out pickets to protect the landing point. The main column set off on foot the next morning, the Chinese keeping their distance. As the column approached the city walls, the men could make out 4 large forts positioned on the steep northern heights, each fort circular or square in shape and bristling with cannon. The city walls were also lined with guns and jingals, large-caliber 2-man Chinese blunderbusses. The 49th Foot swiftly occupied various heights, while the 37th Madras Native Infantry was ordered to occupy a height to the left of the outermost fort. The 18th Royal Irish and the Royal Marines took a height opposite a square tower in the city wall, while the Naval Brigade occupied heights to the right of this position in front of 2 oblong forts near Canton's mighty North Gate. From these positions, the British attempted to storm the forts and walls. Large numbers of Chinese troops crowded the defences, colourful banners flying in the wind. The 49th Foot first entered both of the forts on the left, with the 37th Madras close behind. After a few shots were exchanged, the Chinese garrisons fled to the city, and both forts were swiftly occupied. At this moment our situation was not the most secure in face of a force which by all accounts must have amounted to 40,000 men, wrote Captain Humphrey Senhouse. "We had gained the exterior forts gallantly, but a warm fire soon came from the town walls, and numerous bodies advanced, drew out, and came under the ridges within pistol shot of our gate." Chinese infantry and formed units attempted to close with the British head-on, while another large party tried to cut Gough's communications back to the beach. But, as Senhouse noted, the skirmishers were, however, soon driven back, and in their retreat drawing our troops after them. Our men were warmly fired at from the heights, divided from them by a rice field. 2 narrow paths only led to it, but the Royal Irish led in the most gallant manner by Captains Grattan and Sargent on one pathway, the former of whom encouraged his grenadiers amidst a heavy fire, preceding them at some distance. The 18th Royal Irish commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Adams, led a second group along the pathway on the left. They were reinforced by a company of Royal Marines from HMS Druid under Lieutenant Maxwell, the Chinese quickly abandoning the height. They also started to leave their tented camp on the reverse slope, this movement rapidly descending into a rout. In the afternoon, the British and Chinese exchanged artillery and rocket fire, the British shells setting fire to some sections of Canton. On the morning of the 25th, a white flag unexpectedly appeared on the town walls. An interpreter was sent to inquire what was wanted, wrote Senhouse, to whom the Chinese officer stated they would fight no more and begged to see the general commanding the troops, unquote. The Chinese were told that they must produce their own general by 3:30 p.m. or the firing would continue, the British insisting that General Gough would only treat with his Chinese counterpart in rank. When the appointed hour came and went and no Chinese general appeared, Gough did not order the bombardment to recommence, noting, "It would have been easy to have burned the town." Heavy rain started, and the troops instead spent their time preparing to assault the massive city walls. The British wanted to avoid unnecessary destruction. Quote, "The General and myself were equally of the opinion that such a measure, a bombardment, should only be resorted to as a last resort," wrote Senhouse, "and that the storming of the walls and the possession of the heights within would be a sufficient and unquestioned proof of the city being at our mercy." Unquote. On the 27th of May, the troops were ready to storm the city. Gough and his staff had estimated that it would take 2 hours to seize the walls. But a dispatch arrived from Rear Admiral Elliot, proposing instead that terms be sought with the Chinese and the military operation delayed until noon. In the event, the storming was delayed for far longer. In the meantime, the citizenry of Canton, fed up with the incompetence of the Manchu troops sent to defend them, began to take up arms themselves and formed a citizens' army that was soon several thousand strong. Elements of this force began to approach to the north of the main British camp on the 30th of May. A detachment that consisted of Captain Hatfield and one company of the 37th Madras was sent out to drive them off, but the exceptionally heavy rain meant that the Indian sepoys' flintlock muskets were rendered unusable. When the Chinese realized that the small Indian force had no firepower, they quickly closed in with edged weapons, and came to close quarters with them boldly and bravely. The colonial Indian army was always a step behind the regular British army technologically, and this was cruelly exposed before Canton. The flintlock musket, which had been in service in one form or another since the 1660s, was in the process of being replaced by the new percussion musket in 1839. Rain meant that a flintlock's flashpan powder would become wet, failing to ignite when struck by the weapon's flint. The new percussion cap removed the need for a flint, steel frizzen, and powder pan, as the cap was fitted with explosive fulminate of mercury, and though fiddly to fit during combat, made the weapon impervious to weather. The Indian regiments had not been issued with these new weapons. By nightfall, Captain Hatfield and his sepoys were surrounded, but, quote, "they with the great coolness and devotion of their lives formed into a square, and awaited with perfect sang-froid the endeavour to destroy them by the Chinese long lance over the charge bayonet." Unquote. In the centre, a couple of officers had managed to keep their powder dry, and they fired an occasional shot at the Chinese. It looked as though the Chinese would overwhelm the small force by sheer weight of numbers. Quote, "If a company of the Blenheim's Marines, with percussion muskets under Lieutenant Whiting of that corps, commanded by Captain Duff of the 37th Native Infantry, had not then sent in quest of them," reported Senhouse. "A musket fired was happily answered from the square. 3 cheers were exchanged. The Marines coming up gave their volley. They reloaded and fired once more, and the brave sepoys were liberated." Unquote. The British decided not to attempt to storm the city on the 31st of May, following a meeting between General Gough and the Chinese governor. One reason was that the extremely large Chinese citizens' army was a real threat from land operations far from the protection of the fleet's heavy guns, and the British did not have sufficient manpower to engage in a costly house-to-house fight for the city. They also had no desire to raze it to the ground. But they had made their point. On the 1st of June, the British troops withdrew in good order from the 4 forts they had occupied, and by 8:30 p.m. every man was back aboard the ships. British losses amounted to 15 killed and 137 wounded, the first serious casualties sustained during the war, reflecting the determination of the citizens of Canton to defend their city. Chinese losses were 1,000 killed and over 3,000 wounded. After a period of rest and reorganization, the British decided to capture some of the ports that the British government had asked the Chinese to open to trade. The first target was Amoy, now Xiamen, in Fujian province. On the 26th of August 1841, an invasion force numbering 2,500 troops and 15 ships appeared off heavily fortified Gulangyu Island opposite the city. The island contained a large Chinese garrison and 500 cannon. Hugh Gough remained in command of the troops, while 60-year-old Rear Admiral William Parker led the naval force from the 74-gun Wellesley. Parker had been a young officer at the famous Battle of the Glorious 1st of June and had later served under Nelson. In 1828, he had commanded King William IV's Royal Yacht and later the Channel Squadron under Sir Edward Codrington. Now he was Commander-in-Chief East Indies and China Squadron, and would shortly be created a baronet by Queen Victoria. The British followed the usual pattern of naval bombardment, swiftly followed by a landing. The Royal Navy ships battered Gulangyu's defences for 4 hours, but with little apparent effect. Eventually, Parker ordered the troops and Marines ashore to take out the well-protected gun batteries. It was a stiflingly hot day, and the British forces suffered badly from heat exhaustion and water shortages. Once again, Chinese troops refused to fight for their positions, and after a short but desultory resistance, the British forces, led by the 18th Royal Irish, captured the defences, for the losses of only 2 men killed and 15 wounded. Chinese casualties were heavy. The next day, the remaining Chinese garrison of Amoy pulled out without a fight, and the British occupied the city. The 18th Royal Irish and HMS Druid, Pylades and Algerine garrisoned and protected the island. Within a short time, British and other foreign traders began to arrive, quickly turning Gulangyu Island into a secure little enclave under British protection. On the 29th of September, the British fleet returned to Chusan Island, which duly fell to them on the following day, 1st of October 1841, for a cost of 2 killed and 27 men wounded. The Chinese casualties were, as usual, horrific, with over 1,500 killed. Next on the target list was the port city of Ningbo in Fujian province. However, before moving on the city, the British were first compelled to storm and occupy the town of Qinhai, now Zhenhai, which stands at the mouth of the Ningpo, now Yong River, 12 miles northeast of Ningbo. As usual, the Chinese had strongly fortified the town's approaches with gun emplacements and a sizable army that numbered 8,000 to 9,000 men. The British landing force, once more under Hugh Gough, consisted of 2,098 soldiers and marines. The left column, consisting of the 55th Foot and 18th Royal Irish, landed 2 miles west of Qinhai on the west bank of the river and crossed a large swamp and 2 wooden bridges over a canal. The right column, mostly the 49th Foot, landed on a promontory a mile west of Qinghai, advanced inland, and linked up with the left column, assaulting various Chinese gun emplacements on a line of hills. 10 warships bombarded the Chinese positions. The river was blocked at its mouth by a line of huge iron pikes and sunken junks. Once through the outermost defences, the British speedily took the city gates and occupied Qinghai. On the 9th of March 1842, a large force of Chinese approached the city's west gate, firing jingles, trying to force it open. A light company of the 55th Foot, commanded by Captain Danbany, drove the enemy out into the suburbs beyond the gate. This tiny force of 50 British soldiers took on 1,200 Chinese a mile beyond the gate. Danbany immediately attacked them, wrote Colonel T.H. Shoda, Qinghai garrison commandant, and put them to flight, pursuing them with as much celerity as he could. The Chinese disappeared into the maze of alleyways and streets, destroyed several canal bridges as they went, and then vanished. At least 2 Chinese officers and 30 men were killed. It was now the turn of the south gate to be attacked. The guards were overwhelmed by the sheer weight of Chinese numbers, and they fell back. Captain MacAndrew took a company of the 49th Foot and proceeded down the street that led to the gate. The Chinese had taken the gate and managed to penetrate to the marketplace. MacAndrew instantly commenced street firing and also made several charges with the bayonet on the head of the enemy's column, recalled Shoda, and finally succeeded in driving them out of the city with very great loss. Unquote. The Chinese surged back to attack the West Gate again, which was defended by a company of the 10th Royal Irish under Lieutenant Armstrong, reinforced by a detachment of the 49th Foot under Lieutenant Grant. Colonel Shoda rushed up Lieutenant Mitchell and another company of the 49th, and followed along himself with a final reinforcement company. The fighting was intense. Without orders, a party of the 18th Royal Irish under Lieutenant Murray and a pair of Madras artillery field guns, personally commanded by the 49th Foot's Lieutenant Colonel Montgomery, arrived in the nick of time. Montgomery and Lieutenant Colonel Armine Mountain, Deputy Adjutant General, and a party from the 26th Cameronians stormed through the West Gate in pursuit of the Chinese. Grant led the charge. Quote, "This officer had made a sally across the bridge. The dead bodies of 10 or 12 of the enemy lying close to the gate and on the bridge sufficiently betokened both the determination of the assailants and the gallantry of the defence." Shoda followed, and upon reaching the centre of the suburb, the carnage was perfectly frightful. Unquote. What had occurred in the suburb was an appallingly bloody close-quarters action in which British fire discipline and modern weaponry had ultimately proved decisive. Only about 100 men under Grant, Montgomery, and Mountain had gone forward. At a distance of about half a mile, at a turn in the street, we came on the enemy in great force, recalled Montgomery. The whole street, as far as the eye could reach, was a dense mass. The leading portion, among whom a mounted mandarin was conspicuous, brandished their swords and spears, cheered each other with their voices, and appeared determined to stand their ground, if not rush on us. Unquote. Massively outnumbered, the British braced themselves, Montgomery recalling that had the Chinese charged, they must have swept our small force before them. But it was the British who attacked first. Quote, "We advanced, the head of our column delivering their fire, and the next section taking their place, till within 12 to 15 paces of the enemy. By this time the howitzer was brought to the front. The gun was wheeled up to virtually point-blank range and fired. Quote, 3 rounds of grape in quick succession told with tremendous effect." Unquote. The Chinese fled, their column stretching fully a mile along the canal, with the tiny British force in hot pursuit for 8 miles. Colonel Shoda recording that, in the course of the pursuit, we killed considerable numbers. The British estimated that a Chinese army of around 5,000 strong had assaulted Qinghai. The British killed 500 to 600 and took 39 prisoners. Only 3 British soldiers were wounded in this epic fight. With Qinghai secured and the Chinese army routed, the British also invested the more significant port of Ningbo. The The Chinese, under Commissioner Yi Kong, mounted further attempts to recapture both cities, but British forces left the cities and brought them to battle out in the open, where their disciplined musketry and modern artillery would be most effective. General Yi Puyun advanced from Tunghua with an army of 6,000 to 7,000 men. Recently promoted Lieutenant General Gough moved out from Ningbo on the 13th of March with just 600 men to meet this threat. A steamer carrying Marines, sailors, and 3 companies of the 26th Foot flanked the British advance. The Chinese column retreated. Newly knighted Rear Admiral Sir William Parker linked up with Gough, adding 2 small river steamers and a further 250 Royal Marines to the force. Gough's target was the coastal city of Cixi, located just over 40 miles from Ningbo. A large Chinese force under 4 generals garrisoned it. There were 2 enormous entrenched camps on the Sagayon Hills half a mile north of the city walls, with guns on the walls and huge gateways and large stores. 7 miles to the northeast was another 5,000 to 6,000 men under Commissioner Wan in a fortified camp in hills covering the strategic Changqi Pass. On the morning of the 15th, the British force, numbering 865 men, disembarked from the steamers 4 miles from Cixi and immediately pushed on to the city. Quote, "Upon our approaching Cixi and our occupying a hill which commands the southern face of the walls and the south gate, the Chinese fired all the guns and jingals they had for the defence of this gate," wrote Gough, "but with so little effect and at so great a distance that it led me to believe that they did not propose to defend the city." Unquote. Lieutenant Colonel Montgomery brought forward 2 guns, and Gough determined to storm the city at once and also to carry the Chinese encampments on the hills. The Naval Brigade stormed the city walls, climbed them, and formed up on their ramparts. The 18th Royal Irish dispersed the enemy to their front and moved on to the North Gate. The 49th Foot and the Naval Brigade then converged on the gate, which was located on the spur of a low hill. The majority of the Chinese positions were dug in on the adjacent rugged hills and appeared formidable. The 18th, with a company from the 36th Madras, was ordered to move up a ravine and occupy a hill to the left of the position. The Naval Brigade moved under the city walls and occupied 2 large buildings in front of the right-hand Chinese encampment. They were to push forward once the 18th had taken the summit of the hill that they were assaulting, in the process turning the Chinese left flank. The 49th was ordered to attack a large Chinese camp to its front. Gough wanted to cut the Chinese defenders off from Cixi. Defending the 2 camps were some of the best troops that the British had so far encountered, including 500 men of the elite Imperial Guards, who Gough called remarkably fine men. There were also Muslim Gansu troops, a strong and muscular race, it was said, and units from Shanxi province. The steep country slowed the British approach, but when the advance sounded, quote, "the 49th, with their accustomed spirit, rushed up the hill, overcoming all opposition, and crowned its height within a few minutes, driving everything before them." Unquote. Admiral Parker personally led the Naval Brigade in the assault, and they quickly reached the summit of their hill and captured the Chinese works. A large force of Chinese began to ascend the hill's reverse slope, but Gough spotted them and directed the 49th to cut them off. Quote, "The carnage at the foot of this hill was extraordinarily great. The 49th in rear and the Naval Brigade in front almost annihilated this body, as the whole plain was covered with a dispersed and flying enemy." Unquote. The 18th Royal Irish, 36th Madras, and 26th Cameronians dashed onto the plains and cut off the Chinese from a safe retreat to the defended pass, killing many. By 8 p.m., the entire British force was safely ensconced in the captured Chinese positions, where the men found ample bedding and comforts. The fighting for Cixi had been unusually tough. The Chinese troops were among the best the Emperor possessed, and a lot of the fighting on the hills had been hand-to-hand, as evidenced by some of the officer casualties noted in the 49th Foot. Quote, "Captain Reynolds, wounded, Lieutenant Lane, whose left arm was amputated on the field, and Lieutenant Montgomery, severely wounded in the thigh." Unquote. Total British casualties amounted to 3 killed and 22 wounded, while the Chinese lost 1,000 killed in action or drowned in the canals whilst retreating across the plains. Gough noted that a great proportion of Mandarins fell, indicating that Chinese officers fought and died alongside their men. 2 Gansu and an Imperial Guards officer were taken prisoner. The following day, Gough ordered the city's grain stores to be opened to the local population. By nightfall, they had been stripped bare. The final part of the operation was the reduction of the Chinese mountain camp, protecting the pass 7 miles northwest of Tsuki. At 1 p.m. on the 16th of March, the whole force moved out of Tsuki and ascended the mountains. When Gough's force arrived, they discovered that the Chinese had pulled out, leaving behind weapons, stores, and food that the British gathered together and burned. The British then returned to Ningbo on the 17th, mission accomplished without further loss. In the months to come, reports began to filter in that the Chinese were gathering a large and well-supplied army at the coastal city of Chapu, now Jiapu in Zhejiang province, south of Shanghai. The British determined to prevent such a build-up, and to this end dispatched the entire military and naval force from Ningbo north along the coast. On the 16th of May, HMS Phlegethon and Nemesis conducted a reconnaissance of Chapu's defences. 2 gun emplacements with 7 and 5 cannon each were located 3/4 of the way up a steep hill and covered a large sandy beach. The city of Chapu lay 2 miles from the bay, and a range of heights terminated at the beach. The Chinese had fortified the heights, and they occupied a strong position, garrisoned by up to 10,000 troops. On the afternoon of the 17th, the 72-gun HMS Cornwallis led 11 other assorted warships and transports into Chapu Bay and anchored. At daybreak on the following day, the ships landed 2,220 soldiers, sailors, and marines at the eastern terminus of the heights. HMS Blonde and Cornwallis attacked the Chinese sea batteries on the hill. A Joss house, as the British referred to temples, and 3 masked gun batteries with 30 cannon crowned the top of this hill. The Chinese defences on the heights consisted of large numbers of matchlock muskets and jingals. HMS Sesostris, a 4-gun steamer, dispersed these Chinese troops with shells as the British force advanced. And, quote, the inhabitants of the suburbs and city were duly warned to retire out of the line of fire, noted Rear Admiral Parker. By 9 a.m. all of Gough's troops were ashore. Quote, the general, with his accustomed energy, immediately pushed forward at their head, wrote Parker, the ships opening their fire at the same time on the batteries, unquote. Except for one celebrated incident, the Chinese defenders largely took to their heels. The Naval Brigade, under Captain Bourchier, took possession of the batteries before the Chinese could ignite mines that had been placed beneath them. Bourchier's men cut off large numbers of Chinese troops who were trying to reach Chapu. Most Chinese fled. Quote, but a body of several hundred Tartar troops, having thrown themselves into a large joss house between the heights and the city, resisted with such desperation that they were not subdued until the buildings fell in ruins over them, and not more than 50 men were brought out alive, unquote. During the fierce fighting to capture this temple, the commanding officer of the 18th Royal Irish, Lieutenant Colonel Tomlinson, was killed along with several of his men, and Lieutenant Colonel Mountain, Deputy Adjutant General, was severely wounded. Altogether, the British lost 11 killed and 56 wounded, against probably 1,500 Chinese casualties. Commander Watson from the Modeste took an advance party of seamen in boats and crossed a canal to assault the city of Chapu. Quote, the city was escalated and occupied with very little resistance, noted Parker. Military stores were destroyed. The local citizenry rampaged through their own city, shocking the British by their behaviour. Quote, the plunder and devastation committed by the natives from the moment of our entering the city has perhaps exceeded that of any place we have yet visited, unquote. Many locals believed that the British were about to massacre them, so they murdered their own children and then committed suicide before order could be restored. The penultimate action of the First Opium War was the neutralization of the powerful Wuzhong forts that guarded the entrance to the Yangtze River. If the British could take the forts, the way would be open to capture the walled city of Shanghai and move upriver to the ancient Ming dynasty capital of Nanking, now Nanjing. The fleet sailed from Chapu on the 28th of May 1842 and headed north towards Wuzhong. The first problem that the British faced was making accurate charts of the Yangtze River estuary, as it was extremely shallow for large ships. Detailed reconnaissance was made until the 4th of June. Difficult tides, calms, fogs, and the necessity to anchor at night meant that it was not until the 8th of June that the fleet finally rendezvoused off the Amherst Rocks near the Yangtze's mouth. The steam vessels Modeste, Nemesis, and Pluto were positioned off Wuzhong to intercept any Chinese communications to the defending forts, while 6 smaller vessels were placed as beacons at the edge of the shoals on the north side of the channel heading into the Yangtze. This was very important, as no landmarks were visible on the low banks of the river. Despite these precautions, HMS Ariadne ran into a large unmarked rock and was badly damaged. The fleet crept 30 miles up to Wuzhong through shallows that were often only 3 feet deep. The bank at the river entrance was lined with strong Chinese batteries, the western side presenting for 3 miles an uninterrupted fortified embankment, mounting 134 guns between the city of Baoshan, today a suburb of Shanghai, and the village of Wuzhong. A creek bound Wuzhong, on the opposite bank of which was a semicircular battery mounting 10 24-pounders to flank the entrance to the river. Another fort of 21 guns was located at the eastern entrance to Wuzhong. The river mouth was only 320 yards wide, but was covered in total by 175 guns. Finding a landing place was to prove difficult. The Royal Navy spent more time charting the estuary, marking passages and dropping buoys. It was decided that the sailing warships would be towed up the river by the steam gunboats. Blonde and Cornwallis would anchor against the heaviest batteries at the entrance on the western side. Then the sloops would proceed higher up under the cover of the bigger ship's guns to attack Wuzhong village and the flanking battery opposite. Quote, Captain Bourchier led in with his accustomed gallantry and ability, closely followed by the Cornwallis bearing my flag, noted the promoted Vice Admiral Parker, under a heavy fire from the batteries on both sides. HMS Algerine came up astern of the Cornwallis, and the Sesostris proceeded to take station to enfilade the fort on the eastern side, but ran aground. HMS Tenasserim attempted to bombard the eastern battery as well, but she also ran aground. It is but justice to say that the Chinese evinced much firmness at their guns, wrote Parker, and kept up a smart fire for a considerable time, although it gradually slackened after the ships opened on them. By 8 p.m. the Chinese had abandoned their guns under a terrific bombardment, but large bodies of Chinese troops were observed taking position to resist any British landings. More broadsides dispersed these units, along with a few rockets. Modeste pushed on to the creek at Wuzhong village. HMS Columbine and Clio approached the opposite bank of the semicircular battery, which the Chinese immediately abandoned. Landings by seamen and marines were effected shortly afterwards, and the batteries captured. The eastern battery was abandoned shortly afterwards, and seamen and marines from Sesostris and Tenasserim destroyed the guns and works. The Chinese attempted to disrupt the British operation by sending 13 war junks against them, but this move failed miserably when every Chinese vessel was blown to pieces by the steamships Nemesis and Phlegethon. Nemesis then ran aground and was stuck fast for several hours. With the gun batteries neutralized, General Gough landed his troops without incident and captured Baoshan town without shot being fired. Total British losses for the operation amounted to 2 killed and 25 wounded, while the Chinese lost hundreds killed and injured. Britain now controlled access to the Yangtze River, entrance to the rice basket of China. South of Baoshan, on a tributary of the Yangtze named the Wangpu River, sat the ancient walled town of Shanghai. General Gough occupied it with virtually no resistance, opening the way for the establishment of a British trading concession that would in time grow into the massive Shanghai metropolis and turn an insignificant water town into China's most important city. With its simultaneous control of Canton and the Pearl River Delta, Britain had achieved most of its war aims. One last task remained for the British forces: to seize Nanking, the former capital city of China that was located about 200 miles up the Yangtze River from Shanghai. It was of enormous political significance to the Chinese, and its capture would cut China in half. On the 6th of July, the expedition left Wuzhong. 70 British ships started up the largely unknown Yangtze River. On the 14th, a few shots were fired at the leading ships by some small riverside batteries, but hastily landed Royal Marines soon chased off the gunners. 2 days later, Admiral Parker and General Gough, aboard the steam frigate Vixen, conducted a detailed reconnaissance of Qingqiang, now Zhenjiang, a walled town located half a mile from the river and next to the Grand Canal. This city was captured after a stiff fight. British casualties amounting to 34 dead, 107 wounded and 3 missing, the first really significant casualties of the entire war. The British force continued its relentless advance on Nanking, and at this point the Emperor decided to negotiate. After such a series of military and naval victories, it was inevitable that the British would ruthlessly exploit their advantage during the negotiations. On the 29th of August 1842, 3 Qing envoys met with diplomat Sir Henry Pottinger aboard the Cornwallis, moored before Nanking, a city now under British guns. A 53-year-old baronet, Pottinger had replaced Charles Elliot as plenipotentiary to China. The Qing representatives were led by Ke Ying, 55-year-old member of the imperial house of Eisin-Joro and viceroy of Liangguang. 2 other high Manchu officials, Yi Lebu and Ninjian, assisted him. The British dictated the terms of the Treaty of Nanking, and Ke Ying largely acceded to their requests. The alternative was more fighting, and the Chinese knew that they would lose. Better to soothe the barbarians now than to have them take everything they wanted by force. The treaty opened 5 Chinese ports to British trade: Canton, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningbo and Shanghai. It also permitted British consuls to reside in those cities. The Chinese government agreed to pay the British $6 million silver for the opium that they had destroyed in 1839, $3 million in compensation for debts owed to British merchants by Chinese merchants in Canton, and $12 million in war reparations. In total, 21 million silver dollars was to be paid in installments over 3 years, late payments incurring a 5% interest rate. Finally, Hong Kong Island was to be ceded to Great Britain in perpetuity and would become a crown colony. In return, the British withdrew their forces from Nanking and the Grand Canal. The Treaty of Nanking had not settled one very important point, and the original catalyst for war, namely the status of the opium trade in China. In fact, the punitive treaty really only laid the groundwork for another war over the same issues just 14 years later. At this time, the British and their new French and American allies would not find the Chinese to be the military pushovers that they had been in 1839 to 42. Tune in next time as the Chinese make a second attempt to eject the hated foreigners in what came to be called the Arrow War, known today as the Second Opium War, a war in which China managed some victories of her own against the British and her allies. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and share, and also visit my other YouTube channel, Mark Felton Productions, for a wide range of military history videos. You can also help to support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon, details in the description box below.